church hurt, church scandal, sexism, harassment, abuses of power. These are things that have been plaguing churches over the recent past all the way up into the present. As a result of things like the Me Too movement, it's come out that many large and influential churches and church leaders have been doing all kinds of bad and harmful and traumatizing things to the people within their churches or under their pastoral care. And to these issues that have been plaguing churches, and to the cultures that cultivate the kind of environment that allow these abuses to happen, Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer published a book, A Church Called Tav, in 2020. And so here, for just a few moments, I want us to think theologically about Scot McKnight's book, A Church Called Tav. So the word Tav derives from the Hebrew word for good. So what McKnight and Barringer talk about in their book is how to cultivate a Tav culture, or cultivate a good culture within churches that help to battle the bad and negative cultures that have led to all of these abuses and abuses of power that have taken place within many large and influential churches and among many large and influential church leaders. What they argue is, in essence, that these cultures that are perpetuated within churches. So the people within the churches create the church culture, but then the church culture also shapes and forms the people that are within those church cultures. So it kind of goes both ways. And so what they argue is that these cultures not only allow leaders to rise up to these big and powerful positions where they abuse power, but it also sometimes even transforms the leaders into leaders that end up abusing their power. And a lot of this they trace back to celebrity culture within churches. So not only do you have pastors and church leaders with egos that are too large, that desire to be in power, that desire to be in control, but you also have churches and church cultures that desire leaders who are these big and powerful people, and so elevate those with some of these ego problems. And so you have negative things kind of on both sides that lead to some of these problems. And so they talk about how a church can cultivate a good culture that prevents these kinds of abuses and hurt to happen within churches. And so I want to talk just a moment about what Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer talk about in the book. I want to mention, I love Scot McKnight. He has a lot of very helpful books that are out there. I got to meet him several years ago, and I just think he's a very good and genuine person. He's a good scholar, but he also cares about churches. He cares about church leaders. I think that comes across very well in this book, how much he cares for the future of the church and for the good of church leaders. So throughout the book, what they do is they talk about this circle of Tav, creating a goodness culture. They talk about how Tav churches nurture empathy, that Tav churches nurture grace, Tav churches nurture a people-first culture, Tav churches nurture truth. They tell the truth, which is important when scandals and things come up. When they come up, the importance of things like empathy and grace and people first. Talk about how do churches treat victims. Churches aren't very good at the way that they treat and interact with victims who come forward with things that are done by church leaders. They talk a lot about how churches, when negative things are brought to the surface, they make decisions that help to save the face of the pastor and to protect the church as an organization, rather than nurturing empathy and grace, caring for the people who have been harmed, telling the truth. Tav churches nurture justice. Tav churches nurture service. And finally, Tav churches nurture Christ-likeness. And so they argue and talk about how if churches do things, particularly if church leaders do things that help to cultivate these types of cultures in their churches, then you set up a culture that helps to fight against the abuses, particularly abuses of power, that so easily can take root in the way our churches have designed themselves. And so I want to say overall, I think McKnight and Barringer do a very good job in addressing a very pertinent and important topic as it impacts churches today. I think this is a book that is very much needed by churches and particularly by church leaders. It's very easy, I think, coming from a church leader, to get into these positions where we elevate a pastor or a teacher or a leader because of some skills that they have. Maybe they're a very charismatic person. It's easy for us to elevate them to a point where they don't really need to be. It's easy for us as church leaders to allow people to put us up on that pedestal. And what that does is it brings with it the risk of doing all kinds of things that are not Christ-like. And so I think one thing that's very helpful about this book is it's a reminder of what does it look like if me in my ministry or in my church, we have become power-focused and leader-focused and have elevated me or someone else to a place where they don't need to be. And what can we do to counteract that and get back to the church, which is meant to be a community, right? It's not meant to rest on the shoulders of this person or that person, but it's meant to be a community of spirit indwelled and spirit-powered people. And so I think that's one thing that McKnight does well in this book, is for us as church leaders to help us fight against those kinds of thoughts and elevation taking place in our church. I will say, though, when I was reading through it, I did find it a bit repetitive. And so it was very, very good, but maybe not the easiest book to read. Not the worst, definitely not unenjoyable, but I did find some of the things that he was talking about fairly repetitive. One thing in the book that I didn't completely agree with is in the last chapter, McKnight discusses that he thinks churches need to get away from the language of leadership and get back to the language of pastor. And what he's trying to do is to get away from this idea that pastors in churches are these leaders that are out in front and they're making all the decisions and they're in charge. But what we see in Jesus is servant leadership, that a pastor, which comes from the Greek word poimen, which means shepherd, that leaders, quote unquote, in churches are meant to be shepherds. They're meant to guide. They're meant to serve in the way that Jesus serves. They're meant to give up of themselves for the sake of others. That's the type of leadership that Jesus taught. And that one of the problems we face in churches is that leaders see themselves as leaders like leaders in the business world, which I think that is a problem. Leaders in eldership groups become like CEOs and committees and all these different things in business, which brings us to a place where we're no longer living to serve. We're no longer operating in a way that's seeking to bring glory to Jesus, but we're operating like a business. We're desiring power. We're desiring influence. We're desiring to attract people with the product that we're presenting to them. We have to protect the business at all costs. So a scandal comes up, we don't help people. So as McKnight talks about, we don't nurture justice and grace and a people-first culture, but we try to save the business. And I think that McKnight is right in all of those cases. I think there's a very big problem when churches try to identify themselves as a business, but I'm not sure we need to completely get rid of the term leader. I think that might be just a little bit of an overstatement, though I agree with the point that he's trying to make, that leadership is servant leadership. But at the same time, I think in churches we need leaders. We just need to redefine what leader looks like. We do at times need people to step out in front and to guide us in the direction, as a shepherd would with the sheep, that the Spirit is leading the church to go. I do think that at points we need leaders that are able to make decisions through spiritual discernment and guidance and prayer and fasting to go and help the church. So I think that might be a little bit of an overstatement, but nevertheless, I agree with the point that McKnight makes. So overall, if I was to rate this book out of 10, I think I would give it a 7. I think it could have been written a little better, though I like the way all of Scot McKnight's books are written. I think that this was not the best written. I think it might have been a little rushed to go and address an important topic, but nevertheless, I think it's a very good book. I think it's very helpful to a very important and substantial problem in churches, and I think all church leaders can get something out of reading this book, if nothing less than helping you think about yourself and your ministry and your church, and whether or not you have started to ease towards this elevation and glorification of yourself and of your position, and how to kind of fight against that to prevent further abuses of power, to prevent people in your congregation being hurt by your church and by your ministry and by your actions, and most particularly by your church culture. So I would recommend this book definitely for all church leaders.